Okay. The 8,506th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Mark Lowcock, Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. Mr. Eduardo Stein, UNHCR IOM Joint Special Representative for Venezuelan Refugees and Migrants in the region, and Ms. Kathleen Page, researcher at Johns Hopkins University. It is so decided. Mr. Stein is joining via video teleconference from Panama City. I also wish to acknowledge and express our pleasure to have the Secretary General here today, Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda, and I'll give the floor to Mr. Mark Lowcock.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Let me be clear from the outset that there is a very real humanitarian problem in Venezuela. The United Nations is willing and able to respond, consistent with the long-standing mandate member states have agreed for principled humanitarian action. We can do more to relieve the suffering of the people of Venezuela if we get more help and support from all stakeholders. Since Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo last briefed you on 26 February, the humanitarian situation has worsened. Recurrent widespread power outages have affected the whole country. Without electricity from the grid, many hospitals have struggled to carry out essential surgical procedures and to sustain intensive care services and dialysis treatment. Water and sewage systems have been interrupted, economic decline has continued, and the purchasing power of ordinary people has fallen further, rendering food even less affordable for many families. The scale of need is significant and growing. The United Nations is working in Venezuela to expand the provision of humanitarian assistance. Our efforts are in line with the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence, as determined by the General Assembly in Resolutions 46-182 and 58-114. The Secretary General has expressed his concern for the people in Venezuela. I echo that concern. I'll focus my briefing today on, first, the priority humanitarian needs in Venezuela, second, our efforts to assist the most vulnerable people, and third, the areas where we seek your collective support. Mr. President, we recently produced a draft overview report on priority humanitarian needs in Venezuela. The review was based on the best available data from all available official and unofficial sources, including government data. We gave our draft report to the government and the National Assembly on 27 March. We estimate that 7 million people in Venezuela need humanitarian assistance. That is some 25% of the population. There are people in need throughout the country, but needs are most severe in the 3 states in the south and the Zulia and Lara states in the west. People with chronic health conditions, pregnant and nursing women, children under 5, indigenous people, people on the move, and those living with disabilities are among the most vulnerable. Mr. President, the context is a severe and continuing economic contraction with associated dramatic increases in inflation on a scale seen in few, if any, other countries around the world in recent years. Our review found that access to nutrient-rich foods and a varied diet has diminished. Historically, Venezuela has imported up to 75% of its food. As a result of the crisis, the availability and affordability of food has fallen, with lower imports, reduced local production, and declining purchasing power. Many people depend on subsidized food to meet their needs. 6 million families across the country reportedly benefit from food supplies distributed by the government. Despite this, malnutrition has increased, especially in areas with the highest poverty rates. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization has estimated that in 2018, some 3.7 million people suffered from undernourishment. The prevalence of undernourishment has almost trebled over a 5-year period. Other aid organizations report an increase in the global acute malnutrition rate among children under 5. We estimate that 1.9 million people require nutritional assistance, including 1.3 million children under 5. More data is needed to improve our understanding of the nutrition and food security situation. The Venezuelan health system is strained by shortages in personnel, medical supplies, equipment, and electricity. Reduced access to medicines has increased the risk of morbidity and mortality from diabetes, hypertension, cancer, and HIV/AIDS. Preventable diseases like tuberculosis, diphtheria, measles, and malaria have resurfaced. The World Health Organization registered more than 400,000 cases of malaria in 2017, nearly 70% more than the year before. That was the largest increase in the world that year. Overall, we estimate some 2.8 million people need health assistance, including 1.1 million children under 5. Health problems are exacerbated by insufficient access to clean water and inadequate sanitation systems. One estimate suggests that 17% of people living in poverty have no access to safe water or receive it only once a fortnight. Recent power outages are making this problem worse. Some families have resorted to using water from unclean sources because they cannot afford safe water. Sanitation systems have deteriorated, affecting solid waste management, among other services. Basic hygiene needs, like hand washing, are undermined by the unavailability or unaffordability of water and cleaning supplies. We estimate that some 4.3 million people require water and sanitation assistance. The crisis has interrupted the education of more than 1 million children. Many families cannot afford the transportation, clothing, or shoes children need to go to school. The population on the move is at particular risk of protection violations, as are women and girls, who compose 72% of trafficking victims. More than 3.4 million people have already left the country. We estimate that some 2.7 million people still inside Venezuela require protection, assistance, and services. Mr. President, let me now move on to how we are assisting the most vulnerable people. The United Nations and other humanitarian organizations are on the ground, and we have been expanding our operations. Since 2017, the number of UN staff has increased from 210 to nearly 400. UN agencies are working in all 24 states. Our efforts are particularly concentrated in the vulnerable border states of Zulia, Táchira, and Bolivar. To support the expansion of humanitarian assistance, I released $9 million from the Central Emergency Response Fund in late 2018. Through this grant, as well as bilateral funding from donors, the UN has provided 189,000 children with preventive and curative treatment for acute malnutrition, expanded maternal and child health through the provision of medicines and supplies from 74,000 health kits, donated 10 generators to provide emergency power to hospitals, installed water tanks in hospitals to ensure a safe supply of water for paediatric and maternal services, distributed 10 million tablets for the treatment of HIV among 50,000 people across all 24 states, and delivered 176,000 doses of vaccine against measles, mumps and rubella for babies and young children. The UN and other aid organisations are working with institutions and organisations across the spectrum, including line ministries and national civil society organisations, and we are in touch with the National Assembly. Under the leadership of the UN's resident coordinator, we recently established a cooperation and assistance coordination team, bringing together UN agencies, the Red Cross and NGOs in Caracas to provide strategic level guidance and coordination to the humanitarian operation. Mr. President, it is clear that much more is needed. We seek the support of this Council for action in 3 areas. First, improved respect for principled humanitarian action. In Venezuela, there is a need to separate political and humanitarian objectives. Humanitarian assistance must be delivered on the basis of need alone. The Secretary-General has repeatedly stressed the importance of the humanitarian principles and has called on Member States and others to respect them. We seek the Council's support to safeguard the neutral and impartial nature of humanitarian action. Second, an enabling operating environment, including sustained and regular access to people in need. I note recent steps taken by the government of Venezuela to facilitate the entrance of additional UN staff into the country and the expansion of humanitarian programs, including those of the Red Cross movement. Additional steps are needed. We need more humanitarian organisations with the capacity to meet urgent needs, to establish a presence and assist with operations in the country. We also need more data and information to ensure our understanding of needs evolves with the situation. Third, more money to support the expansion of humanitarian programs. The resources available now are extremely modest in relation to the needs we see. I would like to thank Member States who've contributed to the provision of humanitarian assistance in Venezuela, including our generous donors supporting the SURF. Your continued support is critical, but we need a lot more. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank Mr. Lowcock for his briefing, and I now give the floor to Mr. Eduardo Stein.
Mr. President, Excellencies, the situation in Venezuela has resulted in a population outflow, the magnitude of which is unparalleled in the modern history of the region. At present, with the last figures at hand, we estimate 3.7 million Venezuelans outside of their country, approximately 80% of which have left since 2015. Although the vast majority of Venezuelans who have left home can be found in neighboring countries and other parts of South America, it is important to note that more than 20 countries are affected by these outflows across the hemisphere and beyond. Last year, Venezuelans left the country at a net rate of about 5,000 per day, and they continue to leave the country despite recent border closures on the Venezuelan side. If the trend continues in 2019, we estimate that the total number of Venezuelans outside the country will exceed 5 million by the end of this year. The testimonials and feedback from Venezuelans arriving to countries in the region outline a range of factors, often in parallel, contributing to their departure from the country. The stated reasons for leaving include insecurity and violence, lack of access to food, medicine, and essential services, as well as loss of income and lack of effective national protection systems. Against this backdrop of deteriorating conditions inside Venezuela, we observe individuals and families leaving the country with increasing needs and vulnerabilities. A disproportionately high rate of family separation is already taking place as some family members leave in search of opportunities to support those back home or secure the means to later bring their relatives. The aforementioned border closures also make it necessary for the majority of persons to cross the border irregularly and in very dangerous conditions, leaving them at additional risks of exploitation and abuse, including through human smuggling and trafficking. The presence of illegal armed actors in multiple border areas and the seasonal rise of border river flows create additional challenges and risks for the continuous population outflows, which includes the possible recruitment also affecting children and youth. In this context, it is important to highlight the generosity of countries receiving Venezuelans for those in transit as well as those being hosted. These countries have largely maintained open-door policies, and through the Quito process, they continue to work towards harmonized approaches on important matters such as reception arrangements, regular stay provisions, documentation, and social, economic, and cultural inclusion. The third Quito meeting on the human mobility of Venezuelans in Latin America brought together this week participants from 12 countries and observers from 13 countries, as well as United Nations agencies, international cooperation agencies, and financial organizations. Technical discussions during the meeting indicated important advances in the harmonization of approaches in the fields of entry, stay requirements, access to rights, and documentation. Participating countries reaffirmed their commitment to the continuity of the Quito process and announced that Argentina will assume the leading role in moving forward the process and host the next meeting in Buenos Aires this July. Paraguay offered to take over the process after Argentina. A priority issue identified by all participants was the urgent need for greater international cooperation and involve multilateral development and financial actors in this unprecedented humanitarian situation affecting many states of the Latin American and Caribbean region, as well as other countries. Despite these efforts, national capacities are increasingly strained, in some cases with the risk of denial of entry or access to regular migration schemes. The experience to date, however, demonstrate that Venezuelans continue to move across the region regularly or irregularly, and it is in the best interests of receiving countries to avoid situations where Venezuelans remain undocumented, invisible, and without access to basic rights, and exposed to situations of violence, exploitation, or abuse. Taking into account these considerations, I would like to highlight some implications for and requests to the Council and the international community as a whole. First, more support is needed for states employing open doors policies to receive, assist, and host Venezuelan outflows, including the initiatives of the Quito process. Second, communities receiving Venezuelans are in need of support. Many of the communities receiving Venezuelans have needs of their own, and support is needed also for the host population. By addressing the needs of both, we can increase the impact of the humanitarian response, mitigate the possibilities of xenophobic expressions, and create a better climate for the local integration of Venezuelans to the host communities. And third, additional support from the international cooperation is critically needed. Despite some important contributions to date, on the whole, more is needed in terms of financial support to countries and other actors engaged in the humanitarian response. These contributions not only strengthen the humanitarian response and socio-economic integration solutions, Mr. President, but also contribute to the stability as a whole as it faces unprecedented humanitarian challenges. Thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Stein for his briefing and now give the floor to Ms. Kathleen Page.
Thank you, Mr. President and members of the Security Council for the opportunity to present our findings here today. I am Kathleen Page, a physician and faculty at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. The findings that I'm presenting today were published last week by Human Rights Watch with the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Our report concludes that the combination of severe medicine, health supplies, food shortages in Venezuela, together with the spread of epidemics within and across the country's borders, has resulted in a breakdown of Venezuela's health system. The crisis in Venezuela fits the definition of a complex humanitarian emergency, and the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, should formally declare it as such and lead a full-scale UN-led response that is neutral, independent, and impartial. We conducted research at the borders of Venezuela in Colombia and Brazil, interviewing more than 150 health professionals, humanitarian actors, UN officials, and local authorities, as well as dozens of Venezuelans who had crossed the border. We also reviewed data from the Venezuelan government, international organizations, Venezuelan hospitals, and other local actors. The health data we analyzed show a health system that is not functioning, with increasing mortality and morbidity. The recent nationwide blackouts have further undermined the ability of public hospitals to respond to the medical needs of Venezuelans. The latest statistics from the Venezuelan Ministry of Health indicate that between 2015 and 2016, maternal mortality rose by 65% and infant mortality by 30%. Venezuela is the only country in the region where infant mortality is rising and has returned to levels last seen in the 1990s. Infectious diseases are increasing and spreading at an alarming rate. Between 2008 and 2016, only a single case of measles was recorded. Since 2017, there were more than 9,300 cases in Venezuela and an additional 10,000 in Brazil, mostly in border areas. Since 2016, there have been more than 2,500 suspected cases of diphtheria, whereas there were none in the preceding decade. Malaria has also increased in recent years, with fewer than 36,000 cases in 2009 to more than 414,000 cases in 2017, the highest rate of increase in the world. The number of tuberculosis cases increased from 6,000 in 2014 to 13,000 in 2017, resulting in the highest TB incidence rate in 40 years. In 2018, nearly 9 of 10 Venezuelans living with HIV were not receiving antiretroviral therapy. Although Venezuelan authorities stopped publishing statistics on nutrition in 2007, available evidence indicates that hunger, malnutrition, and severe food shortages are widespread. Between 2015 and 17, nearly 12% of Venezuelans, 3.7 million people, were undernourished. National surveys show that 80% of Venezuelan households are food insecure, and in some locations, acute malnutrition among children surpasses crisis thresholds. Hospitals across the country are reporting increases in pediatric admissions and mortality due to acute malnutrition. Venezuelan authorities no longer publish official health information. They have threatened and retaliated against healthcare workers who collect data, report deaths, or speak out about medicine shortages. Objective and verifiable data are critical to assess the situation, follow trends, and create an effective humanitarian response. While more international aid has started to enter the country, the response to date has been insufficient, and there have been obstacles to implementation. While Venezuelan authorities are within their rights to reject particular offers of assistance, they are responsible for fully addressing the country's urgent humanitarian needs. To protect the rights to health and food of the Venezuelan people, we recommend that the Secretary General declare that Venezuela is facing a complex humanitarian emergency and acknowledge the severity of the situation. The crisis should be a top priority that requires a UN system-wide, full-scale mobilization of humanitarian relief. The Secretary General should request that Venezuelan authorities grant full access to UN agencies to data about health, nutrition, and food security, and allow them to undertake a nationwide, comprehensive humanitarian needs assessment. The response we are calling for would be credible, neutral, and independent, as well as impartial, as it would be under the auspices of the United Nations. Furthermore, the UN Security Council should regularly meet to address the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, as well as its regional impact, where more than 3.4 million Venezuelans have left the country in recent years. We call upon the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to document violations to the rights to health and food in her upcoming report on the situation of Venezuela. And finally, we call upon the UN Human Rights Council to continue to monitor the humanitarian situation in Venezuela and adopt a resolution to create an international commission of inquiry to investigate violations of the rights to health and food. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
I thank Ms. Page for her briefing. I will give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements, and we will start with His Excellency Mr. Mike Pence, the Vice President of the United States of America, who is about to arrive. While we are waiting for the Vice President, let me already say that first thanking the briefers and also then asking them to stay, also Mr. Stein, so that we can ask questions to them around the council, and then in a final round you could also then respond to those questions that have been made. We are just bear with me for a second. I welcome and I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Mike Pence, Vice President of the United States of America. You have the floor.
Mr. Secretary General, Mr. President, to all the members of the Security Council, I am here today on behalf of the President of the United States of America to discuss the ongoing crisis in Venezuela and to call on this body to stand up for democracy and the rule of law in that nation that has suffered so much. Article 24 of the UN Charter confers on this Security Council the responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. As another American president said many years ago, the United Nations is designed to make possible lasting freedom and independence for all its members. It is why this institution exists. For 6 long years, the people of Venezuela have suffered under the heavy hand of oppression. The Maduro regime's socialist policies have shrunk their economy by nearly half. In what was once one of the wealthiest countries in our hemisphere, 9 out of 10 people now live in poverty. The average Venezuelan has lost more than 20 pounds through deprivation and malnutrition. Thousands of Venezuelan children are starving. And at this very hour, infants in hospitals across Venezuela are dying for lack of basic medical care. And the Maduro regime, in the midst of this deprivation and suffering, has used violence and intimidation against anyone who opposes their actions. In the last 3 months, the regime has thrown at least 1,255 people into jail without any due process of law and killed at least 40 protesters. That's the nature of the regime that we're dealing with. But the Maduro regime is not only a threat to the Venezuelan people, it is a threat to the peace and security of the wider region as well. The rising desperation in Venezuela has fueled a mass exodus, the likes of which we have never seen in the Western Hemisphere. More than 3 million Venezuelans have now abandoned their beloved country, and if things don't get better, it is estimated that another 2 million are expected to follow before the year is out. Traveling through the region, my wife and I witnessed the results of this deprivation firsthand. At a church in Manaus, Brazil, we spoke to families who had fled the deprivation in Venezuela. And I'll never forget when a father looked at me with his 2 young boys standing at his side and said how hard it was as a father to come home at the end of the day and say, "We're not eating today." And as he said it, his 2 little boys looked up and nodded, recalling those days. And then there was the day in Cartagena, Colombia, at another mission where Venezuelan people had fled the deprivation in their country, and a grandmother told me how it had gotten so bad in their small rural town, her grandchildren had to rise at 4 in the morning to get a single ticket to purchase a piece of bread at 4 in the afternoon. Their children were starving. And she gathered up her grandchildren and fled the country. Those are the stories the world deserves to hear of deprivation. The truth is, those who stay behind are subject to crime, violence, and lawlessness. Thieves in Venezuela don't rob banks, they rob restaurants for food. Vicious gangs and so-called colectivos have turned the streets into war zones. Venezuela now has the highest murder rate in the world, as more than 70 people are murdered every single day. Venezuela is a failed state. And as history teaches, failed states know no boundaries. Drug traffickers, criminal gangs, even terrorists like Hezbollah are exploiting the chaos in Venezuela to gain a foothold in the region and export crime and violence. Were we to let the crisis continue, the chaos and suffering will only spread. The struggle in Venezuela is between dictatorship and democracy. Nicolas Maduro is a dictator with no legitimate claim to power, and Nicolas Maduro must go. But for all the suffering, the Venezuelan people, across Venezuela, in cities large and small, people are rising up. They're rising up against their oppression and deprivation. Today, those courageous Venezuelans will take to the streets again. And as President Trump said not long ago, the fight for freedom in Venezuela has just begun. Just 3 short months ago, after Nicolas Maduro was sworn into his second term, stolen in a sham election, the National Assembly, the only duly elected body in Venezuela, exercised its power under the Constitution and recognized a new leader, interim President Juan Guaido. And all across the Western Hemisphere, nations have been standing up to declare their support for President Guaido. Last month, the Inter-American Development Bank voted to seat President Guaido's representative. Earlier this week, the G7 issued a statement saying the May 2018 presidential election lacked legitimacy and called on the Maduro regime to, in their words, restore the authority of the National Assembly. And just yesterday, the Organization of American States, the oldest regional organization in the world, voted to stand with the Venezuelan people and recognize the Guaido government's representative as the only true representative of Venezuela. At President Trump's direction, the United States was proud to be the first nation to recognize interim President Juan Guaido as the legitimate president of Venezuela. And today, 54 nations have joined us. The Western Hemisphere has spoken with a clear voice. Nations across the world have spoken. It's time for the United Nations to speak. In February, the United States introduced a resolution to the Security Council that called for the restoration of democracy in Venezuela and for the Maduro regime to allow all humanitarian aid to enter the country. The resolution was not approved. 2 nations which continue to back this brutal regime used their vetoes to stop this body from taking action. And while Russia and China continue to obstruct the Security Council, rogue states like Iran and Cuba are doing all they can to prop up the Maduro regime. For decades, Cuba has tried to create client states across our region. While normal countries export goods, Cuba exports tyranny and strong-arm tactics. Even now, Cuban military and intelligence services train and support and equip Venezuela's secret police as they silence opponents, jail and torture members of the opposition. Last week, the United States took action to sanction ships transporting Venezuelan oil to Cuba. And soon, at President Trump's direction, the United States will announce additional action to hold Cuba accountable for its malign influence in Venezuela. And this week, in addition to Cuba's action, Caracas received a delegation from Iran to begin direct air service between these 2 rogue capitals. This blacklisted airline is used to export terrorism by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which President Trump formally designated as a foreign terrorist organization on Monday. This is the company that Nicolas Maduro keeps. And these nations continue to prop him up even as he inflicts suffering on the Venezuelan people. Just 2 months ago, the dictator in Caracas actually danced while his own citizens were shot and truckloads of desperately needed food and medicine burned. Unlike nations that are subsidizing the dictator in Caracas, under the leadership of President Donald Trump, the United States has been standing with the people of Venezuela. And we are committed to helping the families and communities that have been devastated by the Maduro regime. At this point, the United States has sanctioned more than 150 government officials and organizations loyal to the dictator. We've sanctioned state-owned businesses to prevent the Maduro regime from robbing the people of what is rightfully theirs. And as President Trump has said, we can be a lot tougher. In addition, the United States has positioned more than 500 metric tons of food and humanitarian supplies on the Venezuelan border, ready for immediate distribution. We've provided $200 million in aid to support displaced Venezuelans and the host communities that support them. And today, at President Trump's direction, the United States is announcing an additional $60 million in humanitarian assistance to address this crisis. The United States of America will continue to exert all diplomatic and economic pressure to bring about a peaceful transition to democracy in Venezuela, but all options are on the table. Up to this point, while other international bodies have acted, the United Nations and this Security Council have refused to act. But now that nations across this hemisphere have spoken, the time has come for the United Nations to recognize interim President Juan Guaido as the legitimate president of Venezuela and seat his representative in this body. This body should revoke the credentials of Venezuela's representative to the United Nations, recognize interim President Juan Guaido, and seat the representative of the Free Venezuelan government in this body without delay. With all due respect, Mr. Ambassador, you shouldn't be here. You should return to Venezuela and tell Nicolas Maduro that his time is up. It's time for him to go. Members of this Security Council, the men, women, and children of Venezuela are suffering. Their economy has been destroyed. Their democracy has been destroyed. The people of Venezuela are paying the price. And soon the region and the world will pay the price if we fail to act. There can be no bystanders to this history. For the peace and security of our hemisphere, the world and the United Nations must stand with the people of Venezuela. To that end, the United States is preparing a resolution recognizing the legitimacy of the government of interim President Juan Guaido. And today we urge every member of the Security Council and all UN member states to support this resolution. Stand with the Venezuelan people as they rise up to restore freedom, democracy, and libertad to their nation. And this they are doing. They are rising up against intimidation and violence. Even today, the people of Venezuela are taking to the streets to march for freedom. Despite all the hardship, they continue to march. Despite all of the oppression, they continue to march. Despite the opposition, they continue to march with courage and strength because they're marching to freedom. And in the words of Simón Bolívar, a people that loves freedom will in the end be free. But now is time for the United Nations to act and for the world to stand with the people of Venezuela as they march to freedom. History has taught us what happens when the civilized nations of the world allow oppression to go unchecked. When a brutal dictatorship arose in Europe, the world failed to respond. Millions of lives were lost in the Second World War. This very institution was forged in the aftermath of that war, so that nations around the world could come together and confront dictatorship with one voice. And so the United States is calling on the United Nations to live up to its very purpose. Reject the failed leadership of Nicolas Maduro. Stand with us, stand with nations across the world, across this hemisphere, to help the people of Venezuela forge a brighter future. As President Trump has said, quote, "If the righteous many do not confront the wicked few, then evil will triumph. When decent people and nations become bystanders to history, the forces of destruction only gather power and strength." So let us today rededicate ourselves to the mission upon which this body was founded, to maintain international peace and security. And we have confidence that if we do that, if we make every effort to be at peace, that the God of peace will guide us and bless us today, tomorrow, and always. So thank you, Mr. President, for the honor of addressing you today. May God bless the people of Venezuela. May God bless you all.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Pence for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Russia. Vasily, you have the floor, and I turn on also again for us the hourglass.
Thank you, Mr. President. You can turn your hourglass on and move it as many times as you wish, but I will take as much time as I need to, Mr. President. We are surprised and at the same time not surprised by having the Security Council convene an emergency session with the participation of the Vice President of the United States, which of course we're always happy to see him in this room. It's just unfortunately that he didn't want to listen to the other members of the Council about what they think about the situation in Venezuela. Today, we are witnessing yet another episode of a tragedy with several acts in the attempt to change the regime in Venezuela. The situation in Venezuela does not represent a threat to international peace and security. However, the external players are a direct threat to the peace and security of Venezuela itself. And we just heard that today. Today, we've just heard a horrific description of the suffering of the Venezuelan people under the yoke of an illegitimate dictator. And the only way to ease those sufferings is through decisive action by the international community, obviously led by the United States. Well, I'd like to ask, Where did you get these figures and testimonies that we heard about today? When was the last time anyone who spoke today actually visited Venezuela? It turns out that you're examining the situation from a distance based on the premise that President Guaido is the only legitimate authority in the country and a source of information about what is taking place there. And by the way, I want to say to Madam Page, who told us about a very difficult situation with healthcare in Venezuela. And in particular, she spoke of the measles epidemic. I have to say that unfortunately this epidemic is taking place. Madam Page, do you know that the authorities of New York have declared an emergency situation due to a measles epidemic that has been occurring in New York, a few hundred meters from this building in Brooklyn? We have already seen all this in other regions in the world from so-called witnesses who have settled in the West, and they told of blood-curdling stories about the sufferings of the nations of Iraq, Libya, and Syria. And it is precisely as a result of Western intervention in those countries that the true suffering began there, and that continues to this day. Do you want to see the same thing in Venezuela? Just as the legitimate authorities in Caracas, we do not deny that the humanitarian situation in this country is far from ideal. We're ready to work with them to improve this situation. We are guided in this by the provisions of General Assembly Resolution 46/182, which envisions inter alia the requirement of a request by the legitimate authority for providing to that government humanitarian assistance. And the Secretariat of the UN should contribute to that. However, the report of OCHA has led to a dual impression in our minds. On the one hand, it stresses the need of separating the political and humanitarian tasks in providing assistance to Venezuela. Of course, we are in favor of a neutral and impartial character of humanitarian assistance. However, on the other hand, we're disappointed that the information that has been collected and published today has not received was done without the endorsement of the government of Venezuela. So it turns out that we're returning to the not very glorious past when OCHA used unverified information in publishing its reports. We would like to hope that that is not the case. Furthermore, a preparation of needs assessment is a part and parcel of preparation of a humanitarian plan of assistance, which in turn can only be done with the agreement of the legitimate authorities. Not complying with this principle undermines a key aspect of Resolution 46/182. Mr. President, we categorically reject the methods of the United States with regard to Venezuela. With the one hand, you're grabbing Venezuela by the throat by introducing still new sanctions and restrictions which prevent the country from developing normally. At the same time, international assistance that is required by states should be aimed at creating a situation where a state can take care of its own citizens. However, with the other hand, you are also picking the pockets of Venezuelans. You're shamelessly expropriating Venezuelan assets in Western banks. Just from the beginning of this year, you have taken some $30 billion from the country, claiming that only the self-proclaimed President Guaido can use those funds. The overall damage from the actions of the United States to the Venezuelan economy since 2013 can be calculated in hundreds of billions of dollars. At the same time, you call on urgent assistance to the Venezuelan people. And I'd like to just recall that in the United States, not everything is very smooth with humanitarian assistance per se. You still haven't overcome the consequences of the devastating Hurricane Maria, which devastated Puerto Rico in the fall of 2017. At the time, there were serious problems with the lack of water, food, electricity, medical assistance. Some 225,000 people were homeless. The whole harvest of vital crops was lost. The overall damage at the time, according to various estimates, was from 45 to 90 billion US dollars. At the time, Washington completely rejected international assistance. In September of 2017, President Maduro stated the readiness of Venezuela to immediately launch a program of support and solidarity to Puerto Rico to overcome the consequences of Maria in Puerto Rico. Was also there were proposals from Cuba. This was also rejected by Washington. As a result, Venezuela did provide assistance to Puerto Rico through Citgo, a subsidiary of PDVSA in the United States, while the Cuban government respected the rejection of the American people's refusal, did not insist, and did not use this for propaganda purposes, even though many were unhappy with this decision in the United States. Caracas is not rejecting humanitarian assistance that is provided based on the principles approved by the United Nations. Russia and other countries have provided such assistance in the framework of the WHO. Now, what's preventing the end of the crisis in Venezuela are the sanctions and external interference in the internal affairs of the state. As for internal political differences, we are convinced that only a dialogue within Venezuela itself can overcome those differences. The United States has insistently destabilized the situation in Venezuela. They have artificially provoked a crisis in this country in order to overthrow a legitimately elected leader and replace him with their own pawn. Examples of the blatant interference of the United States in the affairs of Latin America and the overthrow with the use of military force of leaders that they didn't like. There are many, many such examples. I would like to once again address the neighbors of Venezuela. Haven't you learned anything from history? Don't you understand that Venezuela is merely a bargaining chip in the geopolitical and geostrategic struggle for influence in the region and the world? Very much in the spirit of a revitalized Monroe Doctrine. And by the way, the attitude of the Latin American countries to what is taking place in Venezuela are not as uniform and unequivocal as we've heard today from the Vice President. It's very strange to once again discuss what should be self-evident truths. That is, the solving the provoked crisis in Venezuela can only be through internal Venezuelan dialogue. And the self-proclaimed president is not ready to this because he didn't get instructions to that effect. But there is no other way forward. In this context, we welcome international initiatives of helping to foster dialogue between the legitimate government and leaders of the opposition. Such initiatives have come from the Latin American region, and in particular, the proposal from Mexico and Uruguay as part of the Montevideo mechanism is very promising. It provides for a comprehensive and all-inclusive dialogue, and from this point of view, it has much more chance of success than those initiatives that demand preliminary conditions to even be launched. The possibility of joining the good offices or mediation efforts should be open to everyone who are trying to make a constructive contribution to establishing an inclusive dialogue within Venezuela. And what is taking place in the Security Council today, unfortunately, is merely another episode of a frontal attack against the government in Caracas and ordinary Venezuelans. I'd like to recall that in parallel with the attempts to impose humanitarian assistance, the so-called well-wishers are actively trying to challenge the credentials of the official Venezuelan delegation at various international platforms. We heard this today from the Vice President. I'm not going to comment the tone of his statement, but I want to say to that the permanent representative of Venezuela in this room was appointed by the legitimate government of this country, and it was confirmed by the General Assembly of the United Nations. Furthermore, these friends of Venezuela are so-called friends are replacing the official ambassadors of Venezuela, abetting the seizure of diplomatic property. And this way, what we're seeing is a blatant violation of the founding principles of the UN, the violation of the norms of international law. Perhaps to actively perhaps the international rule-based order that is so actively promoted by Western colleagues, provides for such a lawless, thuggish violation of international law. But international law does not. We call on the United States to once again recognize that the Venezuelan people and other peoples have the right to determine their own future. If you want to make America great again, and we're all sincerely interested in seeing that, stop interfering in the affairs of other states. You will only gain respect from that. You don't like when others interfere in your affairs. No one likes that. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Russia, and I now give the floor to the representative of Peru. Gustavo, you have the floor.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, we'd like to thank the distinguished briefers for the very valuable information provided at today's informative briefing. This helps us once again to raise the alarm with regard to the serious humanitarian crisis, the collapse of the economy, and of the public services, unprecedented in Latin America. This is the situation in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. In this regard, I would like to highlight that the content of this statement is shared by Argentina, Brazil, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Honduras, Panama, and Paraguay, country members of the Lima Group. Just a few figures with regard to the Venezuelan economy in order to better understand the situation, such as the estimates of the International Monetary Fund, which establishes an inflation rate of 1.5 million% for 2018 alone, a drop in the GDP of 44% since 2013, or the Living Conditions Survey of 2018 in CAVI. This is a joint project of the Central, Andrés Bello Catholic, and Simón Bolívar Universities of Venezuela, which states that this brotherly country, which had one of the highest incomes in the region, now keeps 94% of its citizens in a situation of poverty, 60% of them in extreme poverty, with 80% of them at risk of food insecurity, because they don't have sufficient income to buy food. Thus, whilst the illegitimate regime of Nicolas Maduro hides these figures that show that the economy of Venezuela is in freefall and boasts that Venezuela does not need humanitarian aid, the hospitals are collapsing without vaccines or medicines. We're seeing a resurgence of diseases that have been eradicated. An increase in unemployment, sharp increase. Cities are becoming more violent. Electricity and water provision are collapsing. And the brain drain is offering an even darker future of great concern. All of this is the responsibility of a regimen that has been declared illegitimate by the Organization of American States through a resolution of its Permanent Council. An authoritative regime which silences the media, which represses and imprisons the opposition, and which abuses its absolute power. In this context, migration currently stands at 3.5 million people, with 5,000 new emigrants on a daily basis, which presupposes an enormous challenge for the host countries in terms of providing healthcare, education, housing, employment, and integration. We should point out that countries of the region have earmarked significant domestic contingency resources to provide these social services to hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans that we have hosted. In some cases, this is going beyond our capacity. How did we arrive at this situation? The answer is clear. This crisis, unprecedented in history, is due to the illegitimate nature and oppressive nature of a regime which has added to the breakdown of constitutional order and the rule of law its incompetence in managing the economy, corruption, and the diversion of resources, illicit diversion of resources, turning a prosperous and mighty country such as Venezuela into one that harbors poverty, insecurity, and despair. There is now a pressing need to provide humanitarian assistance to alleviate the suffering of millions of Venezuelans, and clearly the situation cannot be controlled by or entrusted to an illegitimate regime which uses aid solely for the purposes of politics and propaganda. In the short term, it's urgent that we channel humanitarian assistance through the United Nations system and the International Red Cross, possibly with the support and participation of local and international NGOs on the ground. This will make it possible to be impartial and independent and ensure that the assistance reaches those that most need it. This urgent and necessary response should not lead us to forget, however, that it's only a palliative to the genuine solution to the problem in Venezuela, the impact of which in the region is threatening peace and security. This solution involves the restoration of democracy and the rule of law in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, led by the Venezuelans themselves in a peaceful manner in the framework of the Constitution and international law, supported by politicians and diplomats and without the use of force. We reaffirm, therefore, our recognition of the support for the National Assembly, the interim President of Venezuela, Juan Guaidó, and his representatives taking up this mandate. We call upon the international community and the members of this council to accompany the countries of the Lima Group in our efforts to attempt to re-establish constitutional order in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela in order to address the deep-seated causes that have led to the serious humanitarian situation about which we're meeting today. Thank you.
Thank the representative of Peru, and I give the floor to the representative of the Dominican Republic. Jose, you have the floor.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, we would like to thank you for having facilitated this meeting. It's important that this Council take up again the situation in Venezuela in light of recent events. In particular, we deplore the fact and we are concerned at the worsening of the conditions in the country, which has worsened the humanitarian crisis affecting millions of Venezuelans and which continues to drive many of them to leave their country in search of better possibilities for subsistence. According to the FAO, 11.7% of the population of Venezuela is undernourished. Also, in recent years, there's been a dramatic increase in the proportion of people living in poverty. Every day, millions of Venezuelans face unprecedented challenges in order to access basic services such as health, medicines, vaccines, water, electricity, and education. Diseases such as tuberculosis, diphtheria, measles, and malaria have surged throughout the country. In recent weeks, the situation has become even more complicated due to power outages throughout virtually all of the country, which have gone on for several days. The results have been disastrous. We've seen tragic situations in hospitals where the lack of electricity has forced medical staff very often to work without the minimum conditions for hygiene and equipment. The lack of water is another dramatic consequence of these blackouts. In the same way, in very many places, there has been a temporary suspension of classes and work activities, which is having an impact on the country's productivity and contributing to its worsening economic situation. And against this backdrop, there is no sign of a significant improvement in the situation in the short term. Mr. President, the crisis in Venezuela cannot be solved solely through humanitarian assistance. It is urgent that we find the conditions to carry out practical negotiation which will lead to a solution to the crisis through a fair, free and competitive electoral process with guarantees for all groups and political actors, with the support of the international community, and in a climate of respect for human rights. We also must insist that this should be a solution that is led by the Venezuelans themselves and achieved in a peaceful manner. We reiterate our firm willingness to work together with the international community in order to help Venezuela find answers to this crisis, democratic answers in line with the rule of law, internally as well as internationally, and which, above all, will open the door for the rebuilding of Venezuelan society in a spirit of cohesion and a vision for the future. Mr. President, aware as we are of the central role that states play in humanitarian action, and with a view to bringing about a substantive increase in humanitarian assistance for the country, we would urgently call upon the Venezuelan authorities to recognize the serious economic situation in which the country finds itself. In this regard, we would encourage them to establish spaces for coordination and for humanitarian action with actors on the ground, supported by the humanitarian principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence, to ensure that the aid reaches the populations that most need it and that are most vulnerable. We recognize the work that has been done in the framework of the Coordination Team for Cooperation and Assistance, ECA, in order to alleviate existing needs, and we call upon all players, including government authorities, to continue working on humanitarian action that is people-focused. All actions should address the priority needs of Venezuelans with an approach that will make it possible to lay the basis for steering the country back to sustainable development and make it possible to see the return of 3.4 million Venezuelans who were forced to leave their country. We believe that the recent agreement achieved by the International Federation of the Red Cross to broaden its humanitarian action in the country is an encouraging step, despite the fact that the 650,000 people awaiting aid are only a fraction of the total number that require immediate assistance. We are sure that this will only be the first step on the path towards the opening up of new initiatives and measures which will have a positive impact on the life of Venezuelans. We would also like to stress the need to make the mechanisms for entry into the country of authorized personnel more agile and that they have unlimited access to the areas that are most vulnerable. We support the broadening of the United Nations presence on the ground and call upon the international community to ensure that the necessary financial resources are available to provide the humanitarian assistance that Venezuela so sorely needs. In conclusion, we would call upon the members of this council to maintain their focus on improving the humanitarian situation in Venezuela, to promote the principles in the Charter and international humanitarian law, and to strengthen the role of the United Nations in the process of negotiation for a solution to this very serious crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank the Ambassador of the Dominican Republic for his statement. I give the floor now to the representative of China. Zhao Zhu, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. China has been following the developments in Venezuela closely. China supports the Venezuelan government in its efforts to uphold its national sovereignty, independence, and stability, and holds that the Venezuelan affairs should be handled independently by the Venezuelan people themselves. China calls upon the Venezuelan government and opposition parties to seek a political solution through dialogue and consultation within the constitutional and legal framework. Mr. President, China's position on the Security Council's involvement in the Venezuelan issue has been consistently clear. Our point of departure is, as always, to uphold the spirit of the UN Charter and the basic norms governing international relations, promote a peaceful settlement of the Venezuelan issue, and maintain long-term peace and development in Latin America. China opposes external forces interfering in Venezuela's internal affairs, opposes military intervention in Venezuela, and opposes using the so-called humanitarian issue to achieve political aims. History has proven repeatedly that unilateral sanction will only further complicate situations and affect people's everyday life. It won't help resolve problems, nor will it bring peace to a country. On the one hand, we hear tall talks to care about well-being of the Venezuelans, and on the other hand, we are seeing increasingly tighter sanctions on the country. They don't seem to reconcile well. The motive is dubious. To help its people overcome temporary difficulties, China has decided to provide emergency aid of civilian goods to Venezuela. The relevant supplies are on their way to Venezuela in batches. On March 29th, the first batch of medicines and medical supplies were delivered to the Venezuelan government. China's assistance to Venezuela is in keeping with its long-held principles for foreign aid. It is intended to help Venezuelan people overcome negative impacts caused by external interferences and sanctions with no political conditions attached. China will continue its cooperation with Venezuela based on the principles of mutual respect, equality, mutual benefits, and common development for the greater well-being of the two peoples. Mr. President, the peace and stability of Venezuela is in fundamental interests of the country and its people. It also serves the common interests of all parties. We hope that the international community will do things that are truly conducive to the stability, economic development, and a better livelihood in Venezuela, and will, under the premise of respecting the sovereignty of Venezuela, provide constructive assistance to the country and promote a smooth settlement of relevant issues as soon as possible. We hope that relevant countries will promptly lift unilateral sanctions on Venezuela, create normal conditions for its economic and social development, and lend help and support to the country in accordance with the basic principles of the UN humanitarian assistance.
Earlier in his intervention, the U.S. representative leveled unfounded accusations against China's position on this agenda item, which China categorically rejects. As is common knowledge, China has all along maintained friendly and cooperative relations with other countries around the world, Venezuela included, on the basis of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. We support the people of various countries in independently choosing a development path that caters to their national realities. We never interfere in other countries' internal affairs, nor do we impose on other countries. Member states of the Security Council should faithfully abide by the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and the universally recognized norms of international relations, and genuinely respect the choice of other countries' peoples to do more practical and conducive things for the people of Venezuela rather than the opposite. I thank you, Mr. President.